Welcome to another episode of the Animal Rights Show. We're going to do this, weren't we?
We're live.
Yeah, so this is a unique episode, isn't it? Because we have no clue what we're doing. It's not that unique, is it? Actually, hot off the presses, I have today's topic.
Okay.
You ready for it?
Yeah, let me have a look.
Here you go.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Well, we're not going to do that. And I'm not going to say this. And you're not going to say that. That's just, no. You have to do better than that. Sorry, you have to have that back again.
All right. Thank you. All right. You're really going to like this idea. Here, let me just. All right. Here, you're going to like this one. I guarantee you're going to like this one.
Okay. Let me have a look. Yeah, okay. Let's do that, shall we? whatever, really, to be honest.
So what are we doing? Tell the viewers. I'm sure they want to know.
Yes. Well, I'm going to get all technical and share my screen. I'm gonna share a clip, about a 2-minute clip from Tom Regan, a talk he did as part of the sort of the Empty Cages thing. Book tour, I suppose you could say. And so there's an allegation really that that Reagan went welfarist. And the interesting thing is somebody recently made an allegation that Francione is now coming out with a lot of welfare stuff. And it kind of begs the kind of movement question about whether kind of welfare in the end kind of wears you down a little bit and it kind of gets into your system or something. So I thought we'd try and do that. But first of all, so we just go through the first thing is the Reagan thing then, is it? We do that.
Yeah, and as always, let us know. We can only see who's here from the comments. So I see Vegan Potterheads joined us. So do say hi to both, not just us, but also the other people in the comments. Build a bit of a community feel to this thing. But I think it's going to be a fun show. We're going to go through a few clips and say what we think, hopefully hear what you think too, and see what happens on the other side of it. So yeah. Did you want to start? Go ahead and start with the Reagan clip.
I will. Where am I? Share the audio.
This is where I burn time while you pull up the clip, is it?
Well, yeah,
I'm afraid I'm all out of my vegan jokes.
This is where I completely mess up. This is what this is. Okay, so you can see that, can you? So this is going to be about 2 minutes, folks, and you should be able to hear the sound on this. Okay.
To intervene, all of us oppose what's going on. All of us would want to help. All of us would want to stop what's being done to the cat. So we share this common core of compassion. And what's important to realize is that this is not just Americans and not just Greeks who feel this way. Increasingly, what we find is that people in China, people in Korea are standing out on the streets protesting this tradition, this practice of eating cat and eating dog, as the video summarized. They are opposing, they are intervening, they are helping, they are wanting to stop what's going on. Now, animal rights advocates, and I consider myself to be one, we generalize on the cat episode, if I can call it that. Other things that are being done to animals, we want to oppose. Other things that are being done to animals, we want to intervene. Other things that are being done to animals, we want to stop. We want to help them and we want to stop their exploitation. And so an animal rights advocate, properly understood as I understand the concept anyhow, is not a reformer. We're not out to try to make something better while keeping it. We're not out to try to say, oh, if only we could treat them more humanely, it'd be okay to still raise animals for fur or still raise animals to train them in a circus. We're not trying to keep the practice and reform it. What we are after is we're abolitionists. We're out to stop the various forms of human exploitation and abuse of other animals.
Right. Okay, I'm going to stop.
Few things we can focus in there. I think first thing is probably most important. Well, I guess there's a few people who have also joined us. welcome back again, Kristen Hess, otherwise known as Jeremy's mom.
Hi.
Yeah, great to see you every time, Mom. And then Vegan Pixie Warrior, Nikki, Ann, and Paul have all joined us. So just to catch
And
everyone
Anne
up.
I've got Anne on my screen too. Hi, Anne.
Yeah, but I might have breezed through those a bit quickly, but yeah, I mean, just to catch everyone up, we have put this together a bit on. We were finding clips just before we went live, weren't we, Roger?
No.
I'm blown away by Roger's memory though, because he said, there's this clip I watched a couple weeks ago, and there's this segment, and this happens, and he found it straight away and has for our next clip. So we'll get into that in a moment. But I think probably the most important thing is I think most of our viewers are familiar with who Tom Regan is, but in case they're not, originator of rights-based animal rights with the groundbreaking book Case for Animal Rights in 1983. I think a lot of people think of Animal Liberation as being one of the more well-known books to kind of start things off from that era that wasn't actually rights-based. So moving into that, I think the reason we chose this clip is kind of the evolution of the language, because the clip we just played, I'm trying to remember the year, but it's fairly recent and in the later years of his work. And he uses some language that I know we've tried to move away from, at least at the Animal Rights Show. Anything to jump out to you from that clip? I don't want to talk for too long.
No, so the words that stood out for you was the word compassion and abuse, right? So, I mean, the kind of history of this is important in the sense that there's been an evolution of language, and Francione has driven some of that. And so, the way it worked was Singer was first, non-rights. Then there was Regan, which was rights-based, and then there was Francione. And Francione took a lead on a lot of stuff from Regan. But Regan was more in the kind of Singer camp in terms of language. So there's been this kind of evolution. So Francione brought in the idea that, welfare was about treatment and rights were about use. And so we now make a distinction between talking about animal use and animal abuse, because the abuse thing can keep you tied down into the welfare paradigm. Although, as I've said before, no words are banned in this conversation. It's more to do with, well, ableist ones are, and sexist ones are, and also species ones are. But
but beyond that,
yeah, apart from all those banned ones, nothing is banned in the sense that it's to do with. For me, it's to do with the frequency of it, because so Regan might use words like suffering, might use words like abuse, compassion, and even cruelty, but his main discourse was about rights violations and about other animals being rights bearers, that kind of stuff, right? And so that's the thing for me to remember. But you've got to kind of place Regan in his time. He started work really on the animal question in the late 70s. And so this was on the back of the 1975 publication of Animal Liberation by Peter Singer. And then Regan didn't really appreciate the utilitarian approach, which was a kind of new welfare type idea, or a form of welfare. So he wanted a rights-based approach, and that's where he came up with the Case for Animal Rights. And then Francione was influenced by all that. But he did shift on the kind of the language, and also became quite critical of Reagan's some of the things which you probably won't go into today. But there's like the million dog story and all this kind of stuff. So there's been a shift. But then again, this goes back to the fact that social movements do that, and academia does that, and philosophy does that. Ideas evolve, and so what we're seeing is the evolution of ideas. So to me, it's not that surprising that Regan uses the word compassion, but it kind of sounds old-fashioned now, doesn't it, Jeremy? I suppose, from a rights-based point of view.
Well, it's certainly not old-fashioned when we look at the current state of the movement. Most of the claims I see appeal to compassion, love, and these types of things. And I guess taking a big step back, the two main things we have going on here are the evolution of the movement, but then also language. I think if we focus in on the language aspect, I mean, I think the whole not banning words thing is probably going to be a whole more formal debate we do in the future because that's a sticking point. Because I think I wouldn't use the word banned, but I do think if we are going to choose certain language, we should have a reason for choosing that language. And I think that's what's often missing. We just kind of say what's kind of rhetoric within the movement without really knowing where we're going with it. Compassion, I can see being a subset of a rights-based approach, whereas abuse, while also a subset, I do think people are more likely to latch on to that. So, and to be specific, you know, I think that inspires people to seek out non-abusive use. Now, I think as animal advocates, we all know this is a misnomer, but from a non-vegan perspective, it's not. We're supporting the cultural message that we can, you know, abuse, you know, use other animals and still love them. But and when we use that abuse language, so that's why we've got to hone in on the whole, with some exception, the use, because that abuse really just isn't cutting through the culture. We're agreeing with each other. Pretty much everyone's against animal abuse, but how many people are vegan? So there's clearly a misconnect between those, or disconnect rather.
It used to be fairly conventional to talk about use and abuse. You know, use that phrase like that. You know, the use and abuse of. So would that kind of solve a bit of it for you, Jeremy?
Maybe. So I think we're going to get into it a little. Actually, we might as well get into it now, because one thing that I noticed in that Reagan clip that jumped out to me is you've spent enough time. I think some of the people who've watched the show spend enough time to know I'm deeply focused on the language. I think every day with my advocacy, it becomes more so. And I noticed Reagan says that things being done to animals, that to me is a bit weak. I mean, what are things? And also, why are we focused on what's being done to them? Because to me, that has serious treatment or welfarist implications if we're not careful. So I'm not trying to swerve your question. I'm just trying to frame it more completely, because the whole use-abuse thing I could see working. However, to me, I think we're seriously lacking an objective focus on the breeding, use, and killing. So what's abuse mean? I think it's quite subjective. If you and I were to write down on a piece of paper and then pass it to each other like we did at the beginning of the show, I suspect we'd actually get very different definitions of abuse, even though we've been working together for a while, both animal advocates and so on. And I think when we broaden that interpretation to the wider audience of non-vegans, we're going to get a whole spectrum of what abuse is. So I think we're going to confuse people more than we think with that type of language.
Interesting that you define tolerating each other as working together, which is interesting. But but there you go. I think it's interesting because the Reagan clip we just shown is from the, as it were, the tour that comes from his latest book, or his last book, which is Empty Cages. And really, Empty Cages was probably the weakest and the more kind of philosophically shallow of the books. And there are some sections which are kind of a bit worrying, in the sense that, you know, it does seem to go into single issue welfare kind of issues. And I wonder, and I've done a video about this, I wonder whether there's a difference between what happened to Tom Regan and what happened to Gary Francione in relation to the movement, because they used to work together and they put together a fairly strong abolitionist case together, Francione building on Reagan and then them building together as a team. And then there was a bit of a split. We talk about mid 1990s, say 1996, and that coincides with Rain Without Thunder coming out, Francione's book on the movement, and there's a split by then. So Reagan, it seemed, stayed in the movement, and Francione became estranged from the movement to the extent that he then left the movement and formed a counter movement. So he calls the abolitionist approach a counter movement to animal rights movement, and he calls the movement that we probably all think we're in, as it were, he calls it the animal confusion movement. And so he thinks the only real abolitionists and the only real animal rights people are in the abolitionist approach. So he would dismiss, you know, the movement that we call the animal advocacy movement. He would dismiss that as a welfare group. You know, my own group, VIP, is dismissed as a welfare group. He tends to dismiss anybody he doesn't agree with it as welfarist. So
And that's usually guilt by association, just to clarify for people who aren't familiar with some of that.
yeah, there is a lot of that. Yeah, if you share something, or even, I mean, he used to do things like get all his mods and everything to even do screenshots if you like something that he didn't like.
So I'm a welfarist now, doing this live stream with you.
Oh yeah, you're completely tainted.
There we go. That sort of.
Yeah.
Well, hey, if I could just put you on the spot a little bit, we talked about Reagan kind of trying to work within, Francione trying to work from without. Last week we talked about the positioning against, or how to address kind of national groups, what they bring, what they don't bring, and how to respond to them. How would you suggest that you respond to that yourself? If we were to look at the Reagan position and the Francione position, I mean, would you kind of put yourself maybe in the middle where you're not outwardly supporting, but you're not also kind of removing yourself from the movement? Would that be a fair classification, or would you want some time to ponder that?
I mean, I suppose, I suppose you could say a critical voice within the movement. I've always seen myself within it. I think, and I think that I think that's what the aspiration of Reagan was. If I had to speculate, I think he thought, well, look, are we going to? I mean, and this decision took place before the age of the internet, so I don't think that they understood that they could, as it were, go alone in a very successful way. I think going alone for him meant breaking ties with the movement that he wanted to influence, and it's clear that he did, because he said that in the case. And with the revision of the case, he talks with great regret that he thought he'd started the animal rights movement and he'd failed to do it. And it's interesting because he kind of blames himself, whereas I would blame the movement, in the sense that the movement has treated Tom Regan in a very shabby way. I mean, we should be ashamed of ourselves the way that we treated Tom Regan. We marginalized his work. Everybody carried on selling animal liberation. Nobody stopped Reagan much. And Reagan also deliberately didn't kind of join any groups. So he started the Culture and Animals Foundation himself, which again is a peripheral thing, really, because it does focus on art and stuff, very much. So it's not really seen as an animal advocacy group in the conventional sense. And so there's an interesting thing going on, that he wanted to be in the movement, associated with the movement. The movement sidelined him, essentially. Perhaps Francione saw that and thought, well, I'm not going to let that happen to me. I'll strike out on my own, type of thing. And Reagan wouldn't go with him. This is the sense that I get of what happened. Reagan wouldn't go with Francione. And also Francione, see, the thing is, if you break with Francione, he then becomes hypercritical of you in the same way as he's done it with me, but he did it with Reagan. So all the things that he would have talked about, well, we need to improve that, then become a real major problem, and he would just slag it off, type of thing. That's just Francione's problematic personality. But there was, I mean, I think that the most interesting thing is if you stay in the movement and try to influence it from within. And the problem is, as we found with the Animal Rights Show, let's be honest here, Jeremy. It's
why would we want to do that?
But we're trying to influence a juggernaut that is just steaming ahead, and turning it one way or the other is very, very difficult. But there's a lot of sociological reasons for that. People are born into a specialist world which is imbued with animal welfarism, the idea that don't be cruel but you can eat them, this kind of stuff. And then people come into the animal welfare movement, which calls itself the animal rights movement, and then they're socialized into that. So the likes of James Aspey and Earthling Ed and Joey Carbstrong, they all kind of trot out kind of welfarist type language, because
they're not aware of that, though, are they? They don't appear to be, at least. I mean, most people in the movement themselves, included, I mean, I shouldn't speak for them, but I guess we are. I think I would just make more a general statement. I think when most people think of saying suffering, abuse, cruelty, they don't associate that with welfare or treatment, even though the ultimate extension is, which, Peter Singer frames himself at, he himself advocates for humane slaughter under the pretense of suffering reduction. So,
Yeah, well, I think it's yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess that's a difficult one in a way.
Well, I think you hit on a bigger thing here because we focused on how the movement treated Reagan, and I would say that's part of a larger issue, which maybe you could weigh in from a sociological perspective, but almost like an inner movement dynamic perspective. It seems like I've noticed a serious disconnect between not all, but some newer advocates and the critical thinking / history side of the movement. So there's these kind of almost pockets within the movement where, and we've talked about this ourselves, especially with the live streams and stuff, which I appreciate we're on now. Oftentimes you get a pocket of people that start to influence each other and get similar ideas, but it doesn't actually spread out much beyond that. So a lot of people are in this kind of abuse, suffering, cruelty language paradigm versus considering an alternative. But it's just the communication, and hopefully we're obviously not, perfect or anything, but we're trying to, I think one cool thing about our working relationship is we're kind of bridging a couple of decades, just calling it what it is, I'm, about 7 years in the movement. You're several multiples of that, and we're able to kind of hopefully pass some of that knowledge on.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's an entire kind of subject on its own in a way, because you've got kind of generational differences within the movement, and you'd expect that in the same ways there would be that in all social movements, but also political parties, this kind of stuff. So you kind of expect that. You tend to think that it's a little bit like a parent thing, that you could maybe help the people who follow you to kind of not necessarily have to go through all the mistakes that you made, and you try and short circuit that by kind of extending what you know about it. But I think they quickly kind of move away again, like a child does in a way. So I kind of understand. I almost understand the arrogance of the new crop of animal advocates, and I reckon if we went back to the 1980s, we were probably very similar. We probably at this time, we're all involved with the SABs and everything. I'm not quite sure whether we really were kind of tapping into the knowledge of the Watsons and the Leslie Crosses and stuff at the time. I think we just thought we knew all about it. We could do it ourselves. So I think there's maybe just another kind of generation doing that. But to actually kind of build some bridges between those would be really useful, I think, for the movement.
Well,
And
one way we can do that, just real quickly to jump in here, there's a comment from Aditya. Sorry, I apologize if I'm not saying your name correctly. There's not education about how to distinguish the language of welfarism and rights. I think that's worth unpacking, because I think, I mean, I can certainly, in a moment, I'll put up some resources I know I'm familiar with. Do you feel like maybe that's part of it, Roger, that people actually aren't even aware to where to look for some of this information, that it's not widespread enough?
Well, I mean, if part of the answer is the critique of welfarism, then people used to turn to Francione for that. And now, because of his behavior, and I suppose the fact that he's left the movement, essentially.
And I guess this is specifically around the language, which I appreciate as a subset of Francione's critique, but his is more around the welfare campaigns, it seems like to me. Obviously, that's what stands out most to me, maybe I should say. And just to clarify, so they're close together here, the two things I would say for the language point, there's a fantastic group, because it looks like you're already on Facebook, Unlearning Speciesist Language. I've been in that group since the early days, however someone else started it, and that's a really great place to just get slow drips of all different ideas. Someone posted today, is walking on eggshells considered speciesist? So it's these kind of critical thinking spaces. Another one, forgive my language from an ableist and speciesist perspective, but an interpretation of what batshit crazy means, in some of these things, and actually unpacking it. That's a really good place to start. On my website, begininteractions.com, I also have a language document which is just a kind of PDF format that has like a bunch of ideas all dumped together. So depending on how you prefer to consume information, I guess those are two places I'd recommend starting. Do you have any others, Roger?
In terms of places to go?
For language specifically, yeah, to help get that distinction between welfare and rights.
Well, I think that's your expertise rather than mine. I think there, Jeremy. I think that yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I think that the way it's turned out is that people have kind of assumed that they can use welfare language, and again, you've got that question mark about whether they would recognize it as that, or whether they would argue with us on that. But the dominant word in the movement is cruelty, and they think that they can put like a vegan label on the end of cruelty, and to me there's not a great fit between the two, because of the fact that people are socialized, and part of their socialization is animal welfare, and so they will come and they will meet that thing, don't be cruel message with, well, I agree with you, but also they don't seem to make a connection with that means that we've got to stop using them. That there's no connection between those two ideas. I think
because we're not saying stop the use, we're saying stop the cruelty. That's it right there, isn't it? That's the issue.
But you see, I think the activists would say that's not true because we're saying go vegan, which means stop the use.
Well, and that goes back to our question of if any word should be banned, because to me, if a word's not adding to the key message and it could dilute the message, that's a strong case to consider removing it from our kind of advocacy toolbox, if you will. To that point, my mom has an interesting point around compassion. And isn't it possible to be welfarist and abolitionist? Compassion is a good thing. So I think there's kind of two things to unpack there. I might start with the compassion myself, which I consider it kind of like concentric circles, that compassion is a big part of it. I think and empathy is obviously a huge part of it, especially I think for early adopters. I just don't think that's necessarily everyone has to be compassionate or empathize with other animals to necessarily respect them. So I think they're very much entangled, and I'm not saying remove compassion from our claims making. I just think it's oftentimes used as the sole claim, and depending on the audience, they might not necessarily tap into that, whereas maybe a more of a respect-based framing they might respond better to. Before we go to the other part of that comment, did you have anything to add from a compassion perspective, Roger? I know that's a big one we talk about oftentimes, and you love them type thing.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of groups like Compassion in World Farming, and of course, when you do use that kind of word in that context, it automatically puts you in a non-abolitionist position, because you're talking about, well, to move to the earlier bit. I think an understanding of welfarism in two senses is important. We need to talk about traditional welfare. And so we can think about RSPCA in Ireland, the ISPCA in North America, the Humane Society of the United States, HSUS. Now, these would be seen as traditional welfare groups, and they don't even pretend to be abolitionist. They actually just want to tidy things up. And so, bigger cages might actually be one of their aims. In the same way as cage free is a name of some of the traditional welfare people, and they would like to promote things like free range. And obviously, we know that the definition and the meaning of that has all kind of changed in recent years, and so you've ended up with enriched bifurcation. So there's complications and nuances here. But then you've got what Francione calls new welfarists. And they're the ones who'd claim that they too are abolitionists. It's just that they would want to use welfare to get there. And also, what's wrong with doing welfare anyway, because you're going to ease the plight of the victims while you're working for abolition. Now, Francione has argued that there's kind of theoretical and practical problems with all that, not least that when you do get a welfare reform, people tend to relax then and go, oh, well, everything's grand now. I can go back to eating them.
We won. That's a whole different chat, whether we should be trying to win or not.
Yeah, but in
an individual level, yeah.
Yeah, the problem there is that you got to think. Well, you're saying that you don't want to make it easier. Then that you want to make it as So you get this kind of dichotomous kind of argument going on in that way. It's just that the Franciones of the world would say, well, you're more like getting people being, oh well, job done type issue.
We did what the vegans want.
Yeah, I mean it's a generational thing though, isn't it? Because you can kind of do these kind of incremental steps, and you can talk about even kind of campaign journeys as well as individual journeys. So you can think, well, stage one would be to go here, and then you go to whereas the abolitionist incentive is more to say, well, let's just talk about what we want right from the start, and then just be, as it were, be honest with people.
And that's what the psychology would say, wouldn't it? Be very clear about our end goal, and we're more likely to achieve it. That's what Trent Gracian's research is groundbreaking for, is showing that when we ask for that end goal of veganism and don't dilute it, we're more likely to see it, and we'll still see the reductions and so forth.
Yeah, the thing is, I think in terms of the psychology of the movement for a good decade or so has been influenced by a kind of foot in the door type psychology, which is kind of sales psychology. I mean, I don't know whether do you know the classic case about the signs in people's back gardens? Do you know that classic case?
May as well go for it. I'm sure some of our viewers have it.
Yeah, it doesn't take long. It's basically saying that people went around asking people to put like a road safety sign in their yard. It was like something you plonk on your lawn or in the flower bed or whatever. And some people did, and most people didn't. So then they went around to the same places and asked them if they would put a sticker with that message in their window or in the door, the door pane or whatever. And a lot more of those did. And then they found that if you then go back to the ones who took the sticker, then they had much more of a likelihood that they will then accept the big sign, because they've already, as it were, committed themselves to the idea. So that's the kind of foot in the door sales psychology kind of idea, right? Now,
go ahead. I think we're both about to say a similar thing. You go for it.
Yeah, the problem is trying to extrapolate that into the animal movement in the sense that nobody is opposed to road safety. What the reason that they were refusing the sign was they didn't want to mess up their lawn. So you're not as it's not So the idea you can extrapolate that kind of idea into animal advocacy, where you're talking about moral issues which have behavioral consequences and all that, other than just sticking a sign in your garden, which you already agree with.
It's rejecting culture rather than reinforcing it, like you say. It's a position that stands against it. Plus, putting a sign in one's yard versus living in a different way are two very different things. I think just to move through some of these comments, because there's some great ones coming through here. Hey, Nella. Nella's comment around cruelty is, I'm quite sure cruelty for non-vegans equals active abuse, as in torturing other animals. That's reason enough not to use it. I think if we went through that exercise, and the 30 or so of us that are watching here now, we all wrote down what we think of as abuse and cruelty, I think a lot of people would say, kicking a dog in the street and that kind of thing. And as we're saying here, the culture doesn't see animal use as in a wider sense as encompassed within that. So that's where I think we're really kind of leaving a whole spectrum of potential interpretations when we use that cruelty language.
Also, if you just think about again, we talk about compassionate farming, but if you think of the Royal Society of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, well, we already know that within the culture means cats and dogs and horses and other beings of that nature. And might even extend to swans and others. Tends not to talk about so-called food animals or those other animals that are regarded as if they were food. That's kind of outside of that. And it's almost as though, well, there's a lot of regulation within those industries that will deal with that. You're not talking about individuals that kind of kick pigs in the street. That's what happens to dogs and cats. So it's a kind of different ball game. It's a different thing. But
and you look at their campaigning. I mean, just pick on the RSPCA for a little bit. I mean, they've been around for around 2 centuries, and they actually inspect slaughterhouses to say RSPCA certified and all this stuff. So they are reinforcing animal use. They're not opposing it. I think that's a very important, and they center all their claims making around cruelty. So to me, that is, I mean, in addition to Nella's point, is another reason to move away from it.
Yeah, but the point is, you see, the RSPCA. I mean, like, you see this on social media. Vegans will complain about the latest pronouncement or the latest something or other by the RSPCA, and you kind of go, well, why? Why are you shocked by that? Why are you surprised by that? It's the RSPCA. What do you expect? And it's as though, well, they're an animal group, so therefore they should be abolitionists or something like that. In the mind of activists, doesn't work like that. We're dealing with organizations and people working in an established culture, and the norms and values of animal welfarism, to use a kind of sociological point, they've been sedimented into society, which means that there's a strong kind of presence of these values within society. We teach our kids, don't be cruel, and that means don't kick the cat, and don't do X, Y, and Z to animal companions, this kind of thing. It doesn't mean don't eat them. And so the culture sees cruelty in a different way than I think the vegan activists see it, because they then think if they
talking past each other,
if they put a go vegan message on the end of all the cruelty talk, it's all going to conceptually fit. And we often talk about one thing that would be a really interesting section, and we could maybe do this in the show, the more general show, is tackle this issue of cognitive dissonance, because I don't think that cognitive dissonance. I mean, Cosmic Skeptic did a recent video about this, and I don't think people understand that that's not what's going on. It's almost like we're trying to impose cognitive dissonance on people, whereas the idea is that they're suffering it because they're holding two contradictory ideas, which is causing them stress. In other words, they love some and they eat others, and that's cognitive dissonance. It's not. That's not what's going on. There's
requires being upset, and a lot of people aren't upset by it. Well, and I think just coming back to, I really want to get to this next comment from Vegan Pixie Warrior, because I think we're talking about a few things here, because it's interesting, the pairing of animal cruelty, go vegan, the common messaging. It's almost kind of the why and the how. So you're jumping to the how on a why that people aren't necessarily, as we're saying, from a cultural perspective, necessarily understanding what we mean. So the question is, what language do you use? Because we could quite easily spend this whole time talking about, what not to do, but it is important to talk about the solutions. I know for myself, I'd probably bring that into a bigger conversation about approach in general. I mean, my go-to now is focusing on the individual, focusing on them and really getting people to see other animals as the unique individuals who they are, and have that right to be respected. Before I get into any of the language, I start talking, that's my focus. They're my focus. From that, then I get into very objective, what we do to them. And that's the breeding, the use, and the killing, as we mentioned earlier. And I know, thanks to Roger's influence, I started to weave in rights violations, because I think one thing that abuse, cruelty, and suffering all have in common is that kind of emotive, I think it's fair to say, attempt to shock people. We want to say something that people kind of makes people like back up in their seat a little bit and say, "Oh yeah, I'm against that." I think rights violations has that without the same risks, I guess, of getting that treatment versus use focus. So that's like a 50,000-foot overview of my approach to it. Vegan Pixie Warrior, please keep thoughts going in the comment if if that's helpful. I know Roger probably has his own thoughts around this. I mean, is there anything you'd like to chime in and add around that as far as which language you do use? We could easily do a whole session around that, though, eh?
Yeah, well, obviously, I mean, people know that I'm always plugging the rights view on this, and so I would enter the language of rights early on in the conversation, and the reason it's because it's the foundational point that you're wanting to get across. And in terms of all the other examples that you just gave, cruelty, compassion, and this kind of stuff, when you say those words, people think, well, that could be addressed by some welfare modifications. What we need is to ramp up surveillance. We can do
the CCTV thing, right?
Yeah, put a few cameras into slaughterhouses, this kind of stuff. So that's going to deal with those issues, right? Whereas we can argue about whether they will or not, but also it doesn't deal with the rights violations anyway. So if that's our kind of bottom line situation, it's interesting to me that we hardly ever talk about our bottom line situation. Whereas, as you said before, the psychology or some psychology suggests that that's the thing to do. Tell people, essentially tell people what we feel about our relationships with other animals, and then go from there and make the case. And I know there's a lot of, I suppose people are worried about making the case for animal rights. It sounds philosophical, and we're going to come on to that a little bit with a Francione clip in a minute. But the idea that we're going to lose people if we start talking about rights. I mean, some people have told me things like people don't understand what rights are, not even human rights. Whereas I tend to find that they're pretty good about the idea of rights. I know there's a difference between, say, rights in Europe and rights in North America, where rights are more like seen as entitlements, people demanding rights. And there's a lot of people, especially on the right, that would be opposed to rights because they think it's a lot of people demanding that the government give them things. But
that's more from a legal versus moral perspective.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, that's right. But you see,
so that's up to us as advocates to specifically talk about moral rights, not legal rights. Yeah, well, we've never. It's really weird as well because for all the influence of Tom Regan, or at least for the amount of years that the case has been out there, we still don't seem to get it straight that we're talking about moral rights, not legal rights. And I think because we oftentimes just hear the rhetorical animal rights. Very rarely do we hear moral rights.
Yeah, but
we rarely distinguish. We just say rights. I think that's part of the issue.
Yeah, for Reagan, animal rights means moral rights.
Well, and that goes down to the speaker versus audience interpretation. He thought he was talking about moral rights, where clearly the audience, at least today, is thinking legal rights, including within the movement.
Yeah, and I think, again, you can understand this.
We're really going to have to find something to disagree with.
Oh, right.
We're going to have to stop calling these things the base. Well, I think I guess if we want to try to work in the Francione clip, we should probably get to that because we're coming up on the hour. Just real quickly, hello to everyone else who has joined us. We've got O'Neill. Hello, Grumpy Vegan Granddad. I've started watching some of your stuff. Really enjoy it. Nikki, I think we said hello to earlier. I'd like to pull up Deb's comment as well, maybe while you're getting that ready, which is I try to think about other social justice movements, for instance, women's suffrage, civil rights, gay rights, and so on, and that there's no compromise language. The goal is reflected in the words used. And I know from a speciesist language perspective, I always do the flip it to test it and say, would I use those words if I was referring to human, animal? And I think it's the same thing as with the key, other language. We wouldn't talk about necessarily the cruelty with humans exclusively. We would talk about the complete end of violating the rights.
One interesting comment about that, though, would be that I did a blog entry several years ago now. I must be getting on for 8-9 years ago. It's called Google It. I'm not even sure if I transferred it into my new or newish website. And what I did, I Googled human rights violations and I Googled animal rights violations. And there was millions of hits of human rights violations. and there was hardly anything that came up.
Probably stuff you wrote that came up.
Yeah, it was actually. Yeah, yeah. So you got things that Francione wrote, things that I wrote, things that Lee Hall wrote. Some AR's own stuff, obviously Regan and this kind of stuff. But generally speaking, even Google flipped rights into cruelty stuff, and so cruelty.
That's because we are, right? They're a reflection of the society.
Yeah. And so, but I did notice, it's quite interesting with groups like Amnesty International, their language has also changed a little bit. I don't know whether this is, it almost like speaks against my position, because I don't know whether this is a product of something like focus groups or anything like that, but they started saying human rights abuses. And I found that the phrase human rights violations was slowly being replaced by human rights abuses. And again, I don't know whether that was something to do with the fact that they realized that the word violations was a bit too complicated or something, and that abuses was easier for people to get their head around. But I did notice that change. I haven't really analyzed it in any kind of way.
At least then you're kind of like we're talking, combining the words. So we're talking about rights with abuses, not animal abuse by itself. So animal rights abuses, I could see actually having more weight with it. I'm not necessarily suggesting advocating for saying that. I think I'd say violations myself, because I think it's a bit stronger.
Well, it's funny. Obviously, there's a language that you get used to, and it just trips off the tongue to some degree. And so, animal rights violations is not a problem for me, and it's not something that I would shy away from or anything.
Sorry, you're gonna have to make sure people don't take that out of context, because I'm pretty sure you just said something along the lines of animal rights violations are not a problem for me, which discounts the last 4 decades of work you've been doing.
Yeah. I mean, talking about them, as everybody knows.
Did you grow a tail there? Did you grow a tail there, Roger?
Yeah, the tail's gone over there now. So, should we get onto this this clip?
I suppose we should before it goes completely off the rails. Yeah, if you pop your screen in there, I can. So we've got 2 short clips there, like 30 seconds each. May as well I guess play one. We can unpack it, and then we can play the other.
Yeah, okay. I want to just say something about them, really, because in a sense that somebody claimed to me that the Francione has kind of gone welfare on the grounds that this kind of like elevator pitch, which is the first thing that we're gonna talk about. Let me see. Yeah, that's in the right place. No, it's not. Okay, I've just got to take that back a little bit. To about there, I think. So this is like an elevator pitch from Francione about what you would say to somebody, and somebody said based on this that even Francione has kind of, if you like, abandoned rights, which is an interesting one. I will also say I am going to share the audio, but the audio on this video is all over the place. Sometimes it's really blasting loud, but on these 2 clips, it's quite low. So you might have to boost your volume a little bit. And and
maybe look at the captions, because we've got the captions enabled too, so that should help.
Yeah, there's only a few seconds on each one. Less. I think each one's less than a minute. So let me just play this one first.
Rocket science. It's not rocket science. I always say to people, the only time you really need to talk about animal rights is when you're talking about whether it's okay to use animals for vivisection. That's the only time it's necessary to talk about animal rights. Other times, you don't need rights. You don't need to talk about rights. All you need to focus on is, first of all, unnecessary suffering. Do you agree with that? Yes. If you do agree with that, then what that means is you can't impose any suffering on animals if it's a frivolous use.
Okay. Now, what Jeremy will notice is that I played them in the wrong order.
That's okay though. We can mix it up and might interpret new things. Good, doing it that way, because I think there's 2 words on back there. What's that?
Jennifer's saying hello to the cat, so I'm just letting the cat know that Jennifer's saying hello.
No one's left out. Wouldn't want to be speciesist and leave out our cat family members.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and actually, Ms. Stan just said, wow, people actually don't know what rights are. So true. So, I mean, that's kind of what we've been talking here about. And I think there's a few comments that I'll catch up on here in a moment. But first, I think just to break down the clip, the two key words there are unnecessary and suffering, aren't they? So we've talked a lot about the suffering side of things, which is oftentimes subjective. And there's a clip that, or sorry, a quote from Peter Singer that basically says, you know, if our goal is to end suffering, and I'm paraphrasing here, that if our goal is to end suffering, you know, it may mean a vegan world, but it may also mean, and please note my quotes, please don't, nobody take this clip out of context, but it's effectively, you know, if you know, other animals can live in natural conditions on the farm and they're killed, you know, I forget if he says humanely or quickly, one of those two words, then he could see that being a potential solution as well, you know, for the luxury of so-called meat every now and then. So that's one of the key movement influencers extending the suffering argument, what he makes of it, which I just think is such a gross distortion of what this movement truly stands for. And I think most of the people on this call want to see an end to use. They don't want to see, you know, as long as she's, you know, killed quickly, it's all going to be okay. I think that's just such a gross injustice.
But that's Peter Singer's
he's even
position,
conflated. I mean, that's conflated. Like he's seen as and he is a key thought leader in this movement.
But that's
that could be a whole different talk. We're nearly an hour. So.
But that's Singer's position, isn't it? That you know, as Francione puts it, you know, a cow doesn't care about how she's killed; she cares about how she's treated. And you know, Singer's got
just
this
a bit to unpack with that one, isn't there?
Yeah, but you know, this idea that other animals are replaceable. So if you kill one other animal painlessly and replace them with another with an equally good and preferably better life than the first, then there's an overall good being created, because the death part of it is not the problem within that kind of theoretical position. You know.
There's several things to unpack there, isn't there? Because there's the breeding in the first place, which we talked about from an objective language perspective, something I know I try to focus on. But there's also the undeniable truth that it's not just the killing. It's every day, you know, for the animals who are already here, it's every day after they're killed that past that they would have lived. Now, obviously, the bigger question is breeding them in the first place. But if they're here, it's not just that one moment and killing them in this way that doesn't hurt them. Every day after that, where these two are separated, you know, one's dead, one's not, you know, all these family separation, all that stuff that goes on with it. It is just such a gross sophomoric read of the situation to look at those few seconds when they're killed. I mean, and back to Deb's point, let's put that in human context. Let's look at those. Well, as long as this one moment is if we can sharpen up that one moment, it's not so bad. I mean, it completely misses the point.
Well, farmers say that, don't they? They don't have one bad day. If you can bring up Grumpy's comments there about abuses.
Yep, I got it.
Yeah. So, yeah, this is.
That's a strong point.
Yeah, I think people do think that, but that's not the animal rights point. You know, the animal rights point is not. You know, this is the animal welfare regulation point. That you know, we're trying to regulate the abuse within the system and to make it non-abusive, because the promise of animal welfare is non-abusive use. You know, so non-cruel use is one of the cornerstones of animal welfare, and of course, animal welfare says that is a feasible and a common thing to go on, in the sense that another cornerstone concept is the one that you just mentioned and Francione did, unnecessary suffering. The way that works in law is if the RSPCA takes a pig farmer to court, then the court's job is to find out if the pig farmer has caused any unnecessary suffering. What that basically means is they ask the question, what do pig farmers normally do to pigs? And what pig farmers normally do to pigs is seen as the suffering that is necessary to be a pig farmer. That bit's not the question. Then they ask the question, did this farmer cause unnecessary suffering, not just the routine stuff that involves being a pig farmer? But the more fundamental animal rights point is that animal rights violations is nothing to do with the law. as Regan says, that it's outside, anterior to the law.
Which touches on Grumpy Vegan Granddad's other earlier point, that focusing on, like you say, the legal and what the RSPCA is focused on. It's very confined within the current practice of the law, which, as we know, trails behind morality quite significantly when it comes to animal issues. And that brings us back to that suffering word. Do we really want our key claim to be reducing suffering when the RSPCA should be like, yep, I'm on board with that. We're reducing suffering. They're not trying to end the use. There's a key distinction there to be made that we're not seeing as a movement.
All that, including the RSPCA, is in the welfare paradigm, because it's about reducing suffering. It's about don't be cruel, even have mercy. All of these ideas are built into the claims making of our movement, and the claims making of our movement is stuck in the welfare paradigm, because the word that we most use is cruelty, and what we're saying to people is don't be cruel to other animals. And that's an interesting position for a society in which most people would agree with that proposition, that you shouldn't be cruel to other animals.
Which takes us to Nella's point, which any violation of rights leads to suffering, but I wonder if non-vegans think in those terms. And when you've got, normally I like to leave names out of it, but I think when they're a key thought leader and maybe I'll refer to utilitarianism, because I think that's that philosophy that underpins animal welfare. When people take a utilitarian suffering reduction approach, all of a sudden if you can kill them and they didn't suffer, job done, and job's not done. So it's a completely wrong language. I would love to tee up another. We've got a whole list here. We came up with this one on a bit of the last moment, but I think one of our discussions should definitely be, should any words be banned, which I would take a slightly different word line of that to Roger. But anyway, that's probably for next time.
There's one word that can you bring up Rama's one?
Yeah, and just real quickly, just so I do them in order so I don't forget anyone.
Okay.
O'Neill, yep, I agree with you. Is there a humane way to kill humans quickly without consent? Nope. And I love that flip it to tested approach. I think when we put humans in the same situation, it really challenges our moral filter that we're putting these questions through. And Hey, Rama, I don't think we've greeted you yet. Welcome. And Roger, could you please address the meme that giving others rights doesn't take away your own rights because it's not a pie? Is that correct?
Yeah.
I'm getting hungry. I don't know about anybody else, but all this talk of pie.
You mean one mention? So, I mean, that's right, but that's talking about legal rights. So this is a fundamental thing that we need to go back to. In the sense that the animal rights case is not based on giving anyone rights. It's about recognizing the rights they already have. Now, this is probably the biggest difference between legal rights and moral rights. So moral rights is a kind of idea, and so the argument, the rationally based position that you arrive at, the same with human rights, because human rights don't exist in nature either, is that humans have rights which should be respected. It makes more sense to talk about giving rights when you're talking about that law will give someone rights, but of course that could be taken away. So whether law gives other animals rights or takes away those rights subsequent to giving them that doesn't change the moral position that they have rights already. So I mean, one of the main slogans of the 80s used to be animals have rights, right? So it's not saying, give them rights, it's they have rights. And the problem then is not that they don't have rights, it's that those rights that they have are not respected, they're disrespected. Now that's a different way of looking at things. Now again,
it's much more empowering, isn't it? Sorry to just jump in there real quick, but it's much more empowering to say they have rights and you're violating them versus, or maybe we're violating them.
Yeah.
Versus oh, please give these poor little animals rights, and it's a much weaker
Have mercy,
weaker
don't
claim, I
be cruel.
think.
I agree with it. It's a much stronger claim. I remember when I first met you at London Veg Fest, we had a bit of a session at the end of the thing, you know, and we would, you know, I was saying that if once you understand animal rights, it's such a strong claim, and it's not begging anybody for anything, you know, have mercy, don't be cruel. It's, you know, we demand respect for the rights of other animals, which is, to me, a fundamentally stronger claim. And our job as animal advocates is to get people to agree with us that other animals have rights. And other animals have rights because it's an extensionist idea to human rights. And so that's why those two ideas are kind of bound together.
Which strengthens the position, doesn't dilute it, as is oftentimes being claimed in the rapidly growing counterposition to that. But that's a whole different discussion.
I think the other important kind of shift to make, because I always say, if you want to understand animal rights, understand the difference between moral rights and legal rights, and then understand the difference between positive rights and negative rights. Now, moral rights is about negative rights, so it's about protecting. So it's about protecting individuals that deserve protection because of who they are. So sentient beings are beings who have interests created by their sentiency. And so rights are there to protect those interests, to put a wall or a fence around each individual with a no trespass sign on it and saying, thou shalt not enter, right? And so that's what that's all about. The controversy about rights is often because people get involved in big arguments about positive rights, the people that human rights demand. And so I always say that, and I put this in my PhD, that one way of looking at it is to think that our basic rights, our fundamental rights, our fundamental human rights are actually our animal rights, the rights that we share with other sentient beings. That's like the foundation of our rights house. On top of that, we build our human rights, the rights that are not relevant to other animals, you know, the right to education, the right to vote, those kind of things. Those things that, as far as we know, are not relevant to the lives and interests of other animals. So if we can get our head around moral and legal and positive and negative, we're a long way into the right way of looking at the world. And also that brings us away from the welfare look at the world, because as soon as you use welfare language like cruelty and suffering, as we've seen, people are going, well, how can we address that then? Right? Well, the way you address rights violations is don't violate them. You know,
I think just a quick...
You can't clean that up.
And I think a quick distinction that I know really helped me is I started inventorying, you know, okay, if we're going to talk about rights plural, listing out which rights specifically we're talking about. I did that. You know, you can probably list about 10 of them. I could off the top of my head now, but to me, it really comes down to that one fundamental right to be respected. And if we respect them as unique individuals with a life and story of their own, you know, does respect entail breeding, using, or killing them? That's just, I just had to throw that in there real quickly because I think it really simplifies what is a profoundly complex topic. Back to Rama's comment.
Yeah. She's right on that.
Is that kind of saying that it's like it's almost the intersection of rights, because it's almost like we have a legal right to use other animals, but we don't have our legal right stops where their moral right begins. Was it? I haven't seen the meme, like I say, but
no, but it goes back to that idea that it's not a pie, so it's not as though you're dividing a finite thing up into things. So you know, the more that you give away and the more that someone else has, the less you have. It's not that, you know. So yeah, so that's a fundamentally correct point. You know, I mean, obviously, the thing about losing our right to kill them is not part of the rights deal in the first place. There is no such thing as a right to kill another rights bearer. In fact, the way it works is that you've got to have a damn good reason for taking lethal action against another rights bearer. You can do it,
or something like that.
Yeah, you can do it in self-defense, but you've got to have a really, really good reason. otherwise you're in trouble. And of course, that's the way it should be, because another way that rights work is that the rights of one creates duties in the others. I mean, I know that creates the thing about, well, what about the ones who won't, they can't carry out duties in return? Well, that's true, but we've got
the Kantian kind of, yeah.
Yeah, we've got an entire society based on that there's a lot of people who cannot reciprocate in terms of rights and duties, rights, obligations. We get around that by going, okay, well, they can't do that, so we shouldn't expect them to.
And I'd even take a step back, and I think we can get wound up in the philosophy. I would even take a step back and see what, because our audience is humans, what's been their relation with other animals? Do they have a dog in their family? Do we think that the dogs that are in our cats or whoever in our family have to reciprocate what we give to them? No, we're going to respect them regardless. So I think, and the whole quote pet topic could be a whole other live stream, which we'll save for another day. But within those parameters of adopting the ones who are stuck between two worlds and all that, where's the starting point? Because it's really easy to unpack the whole, well, if they can't reciprocate, we don't have to respect them type thing quite quickly, I think.
The thing about, is it true to say legal rights are indeed a pie? Not, I don't think so. Not in the way that it was framed in the second point. The idea of losing your right to kill, that's not a right in the first place. That's something that people are trying to argue for. But in terms of the idea of rights, it's quite an absurd idea, claiming the right to kill. I mean,
Nell's pointing out the whole, we respect human infants regardless, and they're not reciprocating. They will one day, and that's another philosophical point we can make maybe later. But I think also around suffering, I think I got a bit excited and started talking about how there is, suffering, if we want to call it that. I'd choose a different word, after the killing, that you just focus on that momentary few seconds is a bit intellectually dishonest, I would say. My mom's raised a strong point too, though, that, it's also before that point, there's a huge spectrum of experiences on either side of that 6 seconds, let's call it. So it's 6 seconds instead of 12 seconds. I mean, yeah, so I can see you pulling up the other clip. You ready for clip number 1/2?
Yeah, this is the one that we're supposed to have had in the first place. So
I think 35:16 is what I've got down for it.
Yeah, I think that's where I am, I think.
And I'll just have a quick look at the comments here. So Nikki focuses on saying an end to animal exploitation, which to me means not using animals for our purposes. Yeah. When we're discussing ending something, that's a much clearer claim to be making, I think. And yeah, obviously, I think it kind of taps into that, animal-centric versus human-centric approach, because I think most of the times non-vegans, outside the movement view these issues, it's a very human-centric lens. It's not looking at it from the animal, our fellow animals' perspective. How's that clip?
Wouldn't you think, Jeremy, wouldn't you think...
I try to.
Wouldn't you think, rather than saying, well...
Sorry, I'm throwing you off your game.
Yeah, you completely have, yeah.
I was up at 5 a.m. this morning, well, until 5 a.m., so that's...
Well, yeah, to quote somebody, I don't care.
Well, I don't care who you're quoting. How about that?
Is it stronger to say end animal use and end animal exploitation? Because I suppose you could get into debates about what represents either, I suppose.
Yeah, I think we've had some fun discussions just within the Animal Rights Show team. I think I'm the lone representative that I personally swerve exploitation. My critique of it would be that it does focus on the treatment, and I think a lot of people put that through a human-centric lens. I know I've sent Roger the joke, yeah, this exploitation is horrible. We really should get the other animals' unions to protect them from unfair treatment in the workplace. And it's like, I mean, that is oftentimes the use of exploitation. So it's, to me, because exploitation is not often used about ending someone's, use. It's a matter of making it fair. So I think most people probably understand what we're saying, I hope, with that one, more so than the other ones. I just think there's a spectrum of interpretations that I like to try to avoid. But with that said, I know it's a common movement term, and it's way down there on my list for priorities, I think. Not calling other animals is at the top.
In terms of language, though, if you extend that to say end animal exploitation while they're being used, that's not what we're looking for. The same as end animal cruelty while they're being used. That's not what we're looking for. That's again that kind of. I mean, I know obviously we can get kind of really bogged down with the language, because I mean Ronnie Lee would prefer a word like oppression. But again, some people could say, okay, well, let's end the oppression while they're being used.
That's what keeps bringing me back to the objective: the breeding, use, and killing after they've been established as unique individuals. To me, that's the simplest case to make. And maybe sprinkle in some rights violations if we're prepared to go there, and the whole respect principle. So,
right.
Did you want to do this last clip?
Yeah. So the volume on this is going to be low, people. So you might have to think. But it's only it's less than a minute. So here we go.
People already understand everything they need to understand to be vegan. That is one of the things that we always do with people is to say, "Do you think it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals?" And the answer always is, what a stupid question. Of course it is. Okay? What does unnecessary mean? Well, whatever it means, it's got to exclude suffering for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. Okay? You accept that? Absolutely. Good. Why aren't you a vegan? If people accepted what they claim to accept, the only issue we would be discussing is whether or not we can use, whether or not it's morally justifiable to use animals in experiments to cure serious human illnesses, or do you?
Right. Okay. So this actually goes back to the second chapter of Francione's book about his version of the case, if you like, where he's saying that vivisection is a trickier issue because you can oppose everything else on the grounds that it's only done for convenience and those kind of things. Whereas vivisection for thing like medical research, and obviously we've got the spectre of the vaccine on our tail at the moment. That's a trickier issue, and now Francione is saying that that's the only area where you need to talk about rights. Well, as far as I know, that's kind of. I've not really kept up with Francione's his latest books, Eat Like You Care onwards, those ones. So I kind of more like know, the ones from the 90s into the 2000s. So, but that seems to me to be a shifted position. That you don't need to talk about rights. And I'm not quite sure why. One claim that Francione makes is that animal rights as an idea was stolen, in the sense that the animal welfare movement took the name, and because he also says that unfortunately they're coming after abolition now, and so he's going to have to come up with a third idea, he thinks. Okay, now that seems to me, I mean, I wouldn't say cowardly, but it seems to be a weird situation, because if you've got an idea that you believe in and you want to advocate for, and somebody else comes along and, as it were, changes that idea, dilutes it, slims it down in the way that say the philosophy of veganism is currently being diluted. But so what do? You then okay, you can have that now then, or you say no, there's a line in the sand here, so you defend what you believe in. So I don't know if that's what's going on, but there does seem to be a shift there in Francione, because I think he would have talked much more about rights in the 1990s, and now he's saying you only need to do it when it comes to vivisection, and also certain types of vivisection.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to unpack that position further, because what's he actually talking about? I mean, it does seem like he's juxtaposing unnecessary suffering with rights, which, because I think we're still talking about ending all use. It's just because the unnecessary suffering to me doesn't necessarily suggest, ending all use, which we've already kind of covered here today. And Jennifer's just reiterating that point that, starting to see how many times as animal advocates we mention the words cruelty, abuse, and suffering. And I think once we kind of unpack the logical extensions of those words, we start to realize that they're potentially a limited way to approach it. Back to your conversation with Rama. Ownership of beings gives one's rights to them, but basically thanking you for addressing, much appreciated. So I think that related back to the earlier conversation.
Well, I mean, ironically, the one thing that Francione talks about is the right not to be property. So that would kind of rule that out, surely. So we're not talking about other animals shouldn't be seen as ownable beings. They should be seen as beings with their own set of rights. I mean, like, obviously, there's a big argument going on at the moment because Dublin Zoo, where I am in Dublin, the Dublin Zoo is saying that they might have to close down. So so those owned animals are now in danger. So some people are saying, should we try and bail the zoo out to save the animals, kind of thing, right? And so it's a really kind of tricky thing because you are talking about a population of owned beings, and it's not as though they can be taken anywhere else.
It's like they're releasing chihuahuas to the wild. They're kind of stuck between two worlds, much like our dog and cat family members and other species.
Yeah, and also even the idea that sending them to sanctuaries, if you're talking about the big cats and rhinos, giraffes, then sanctuaries are probably not going to be able to cope with that type of being either. So that would probably cost more money than just unless you put money into the ex-zoo and create a sanctuary there, because they've got the facilities already. So I suppose that would work.
Yeah, it looks like Corey's joined us, and I suspect the comment here is in response to one of my bad jokes. So I have tried to keep a lid on that today, but they do kind of creep out now and then. George just said,
probably me mentioning Francione. I don't know.
It could have been anything. We'll have to go to the safe for that one. But because of how they have been mutated through artificial selection, their mere existence is abusive. For instance, birds laying eggs every day instead of twice a year, or cows producing 10 times the milk, etc. I do know, just as a side point, because I know my sister cares for several rescue hens. There is an implant that you can get. I appreciate this is more from a sanctuary type setting where you can almost kind of reverse engineer the, it sounds so weird to say, the genetic engineering. But I think it's a strong point that just the whole, when they enter this world, not only do they have a death sentence, but they have an existence that's, I don't think anyone would wish on our worst enemies, which is kind of getting to the treatment side of things, but it's all part of the big picture, isn't it? Just reiterating, I think this was response to what Nikki had said earlier around animals are not here for us to use for our purposes. I think that's a really, here, with us, not for us, I think is a really good question or claim to make. Rama's just following up because we've got a few threads going here. This is great. Also note throughout discussion, Roger has not analyzed with human rights or killing humans, enslaving humans. That's hard to do in a non-academic setting. People don't get it unless you do, and it's problematic to use human examples. That could be easily be a whole nother call. I mean, I do like to talk about how animal rights is an extension of human rights, which I appreciate you kind of framed it the other way around earlier, but they do talk to one another. But I do think, to Rama's point, if we use those human analogies, we have to be prepared how we use them. And I think a great way to do this that I found kind of helps to kind of unpack it as more of a thick concept and step away from some of the connotations is to talk about, if we did this to humans, what would we call it? Then we're letting them decide versus kind of framing it that way. Then I think you can kind of get to a similar end point. Clarifying. Sorry, did you want to?
Yeah, I noticed what Corey said there. He who shall not be named. That's Voldemort or something, isn't it?
So that clarified that question. I'm glad to know it wasn't my humor or lack thereof.
Going back to that. So there's some nuances and complications here in the sense that human rights analogies are very useful. At the same time, and we might talk about this on Sunday, because when we were having our kind of planning discussion with our guest panelist for Sunday, the issue came up about using words that are relevant to human suffering and making these analogies. And the danger is always that it's as though the suffering of the other animals on its own as an issue is not enough. So that came up, didn't it? And so whilst they're useful and it might reframe the issue and people go, oh yeah, I never thought of it that way. And I do it. I kind of tend to do it all the time. It does have that other side effect, downside to it, I think, which is that it's almost as though you're kind of saying, well, we can't make the case for animal rights on its own because it's not strong enough. And so that seems to be a danger there. So it's a perhaps a nuanced position, but it is one which is interesting, I think.
I'm just thinking as we're going through these comments, if we've said everything we want to say on that, shall we call it the Gary clip from earlier? Because we talked about the whole kind of unnecessary point, because I know a big part of some of his books is compares it a lot with dogfighting, and that's, people derive pleasure from that and it's unnecessary, and then makes the extension to wider forms of animal use.
Oh, the Michael Vick thing.
That's a heavily used example. Yeah. I just don't know that non-vegans see it that way. That's I think a lot of non-vegans see it as animal use is necessary, which I appreciate. We have to unpack that too. I just think, why even use the word unnecessary? Because it suggests that there are exceptions where it is necessary, which I think weakens our claims making.
Yeah, I think it's a bit more complicated than that, but I think that general point does kind of, it implies, doesn't it, that there is a necessary level of suffering that must be okay. Therefore, otherwise the term is redundant. I know what you're saying. I don't know that's a full answer to it, but it is it's where you would start with that idea. Well, if you talk about unnecessary suffering, what's necessary? And then, as we've said before, about half an hour ago, that we know how the law would deal with that. But in terms of thinking about it, philosophy, discourse, that might be a different one. Corey mentions Ted Benton.
Yep.
Did you see that one?
Yeah, and just as we're transitioning to that comment, I have to make the ableist language point from the clip earlier, the use of the word stupid. Anything that refers to someone's cognitive ability is probably best to swerve. And I've actually found my communication strengthened because it forces me to focus objectively, why is it, quote, stupid? Actually, because they're not aware of X, Y, Z. And then that was for our UK listeners. I'm still getting used to the Z thing. But anyway, into the next comment. Go for it.
Yeah, we haven't discussed that. Oh, I mean, actually, Ted Benton is one of the persons who credited Tom Regan with getting rights over the species barrier. And I always say that the vegan movement is the idea of getting justice over that same barrier as well. But no, we haven't gone into that in any detail. And in fact, I haven't engaged with Ted Benton. Animal rights, where's the left, is the thing I think Corey is talking about. But I haven't engaged with that for a long time, actually. So I'd have to have a refresher before I could, I think.
Okay. Yeah, and just kind of a comment around the zoo animals. And we could get to a language point on that. Do we call them zoo animals or do we call them zoo inmates? Would be another language point that I think we've tossed around in the Unlearning Speciesist Language Facebook group that I mentioned earlier.
Other animals in zoos.
Do you think zoos is a bit of a euphemism?
Well, it is, isn't it? But I mean, it used to be. It used to be even worse, didn't it? What did they used to call zoos? It was kind of, some kind of garden or something. Some kind of, some very kind of romantic kind of Victorian type phrase. Menagerie and all these kind of ideas. But that was when the idea that collecting other animals in the same way that people collected exotic plants and trees, for example, and put them in, in their big gardens and stuff, and all the grand mansions.
It
and all
really
that.
reinforces the object status, doesn't it? Just put them in a cage because they're so pretty to look at and all this kind of crap.
Well, they're also unusual, because people used to. Circus proprietors used to argue that there was a genuine educational element to going to the circus, and that could be true in the 1950s and the 1960s when other people had never seen an elephant, that kind of stuff. But obviously,
there's a lot to unpack there, isn't there? Because there is a genuine interest in other animals. It's just let's leave them alone, and then if we happen to see them, great. Versus forcing it. Which, Deepak's question around what do you think of the morality of use of animals which does not involve harm to them? I think while we process that one, we do tend to shoot for an hour for these, but we've had some great comments coming in, so we will address those before we sign off, I think. I think we'd have to get into specific examples of this one. I think through the Animal Rights Show, we try to put everything through a animal rights lens.
It usually well, there's a few examples. Riding on the backs of horses, backyard eggs, and seeing what you would call seeing eye dogs or guide dogs. So those are the common ones that come up in that context, Jeremy.
Yeah, and I could probably name 3 or 4 others. I think, and to me, there's a lot to unpack, because I think when we get into that third example, we start to overlap with ableism, which I think we need to be aware of that before we really launch into that discussion, which I think that's a difficult one to kind of address fully in a short space of time. So maybe we can save that for another call. I would just generally say, that respect principle. I think I'd really hone in, if I was having this discussion with, for instance, someone on the street, I'd really hone in on what they mean by harm. Because I think with your, and I would take example by example, because I think there are nuances to each. From the whole, quote, backyard hen perspective, I would ask, where are the hens coming from? And when you went there, did you see their sons, brothers, and fathers? What's happening to them? And all these discussions. And I think it goes back quite nicely with Nikki's point is, are they here with us or for us? Do this whole zoopolis thing that other animals need to work for us to earn their keep and stuff. I think we need to try to move away from that and just set that clear end goal that they're not to be used. I think you've got confirmation on the Voldemort. I think apparently as far as the zoo getting money from the public to help home the other animals, I'm not really sure how to frame that, if I'm honest.
Well, we apparently.
So, sorry, go ahead.
For many years, apparently, Dublin Zoo was Ireland's top tourist attraction for many years. And so I was talking to Bernie Wright about it, Bernie Wright from the Alliance for Animal Rights, and she was saying that, that the idea that they're kind of, threadbare in terms of money can't be true, because they were always getting. But I'm not quite sure if they get direct subsidies from the government. And also, I suppose from their point of view, they would say that it's a very expensive operation. So if you're not getting punters through the door, you're going to quickly run out of funds. At the same time, they're always buying and selling and swapping and exchanging other animals anyway, regarding them as drafts on a global board anyway. Breeding them, selling them, buying them, all that. So they got a very exploitative understanding of their captivity. Obviously they claim to be conservationists at the same time, don't they? But then so do hunters and everything else. I mean, we know all that, the claims making.
And Rama's question here, do you have any updates on your potential media opportunity? Because that might actually address this comment. I'm not sure if you're prepared to go there or not, but you're welcome. I just took you there.
Oh yeah. No, I'm feeling a bit dicey about this. I'm taking part in a TV program called Eating with the Enemy, and obviously I really dislike the title. And if you go onto YouTube, there's a clip, or there's a program with John Curtin, who was very kind of prominent animal advocate in the late 80s, early 90s, and he was in a program called Living with the Enemy, and he ended up living on a farm for a couple of weeks. I think it might be a couple of weeks. Ironically, the farmer was called Yates, but no relation. Henry Yates, I think. Anyhow, so it's going to be a version of that, but they did kind of say the idea is for you to have a conversation over a meal, and the idea was to see whether people who ostensibly have nothing in common actually do have anything in common. So obviously you could see that, well, that's interesting as a proposition, and the title is clickbaity. It really depends on, obviously, the problem there is the editing could be an issue. I'm not expecting to be one of the ones chosen in a way, because I think I've got a fairly kind of rational and reasonable approach to things. I don't lose my temper. I'm fairly diplomatic, and so you know. And again, going back to talking with any lay person on the street, I tend to do that. I mean, for many years, I've never lost my temper. You know, you're not going to educate that way. Even Reagan said that you can't educate somebody by shouting at them. You need to talk to them. So, and also, just to address Rama's point completely, is that we've kind of tried to do that, haven't we, with the objection of the week?
Yeah, that's a good pitch for that, because we've played around with it a bit on the show, but we started to our main, this is a bit of a bolt-on when we have some spare time, but our main Sunday show, we started, one of the segments is Objection of the Week, which I think we're leaving out this week, but it'll be basically every week we pick a common non-vegan belief or objection, and then basically frame it, and then two different responses. So one's from a rights-based perspective, and one's from more of a common response, or what we might commonly hear in the movement, which we've been kind of unpacking throughout this episode. So yeah, that's probably a good example. So it's more role-playing these days, but it'd be great to foster some more virtual dialogue, though, because I know I miss the street outreach element as well, and it's not the same through comment sections.
But you've done that, haven't you? You know, your kind of street interviews. You start to incorporate rights-based positions into those. You know?
I have, yeah. I don't have a lot, but I do have a few since I started to incorporate a rights-based approach on my YouTube channel. But yeah, I think there could definitely be more in that space to try to tease out the differences. Which I think, to Deb's point, we're all learning. And thank you, Deb, for this kind comment. And I would just put it right back to everyone who's joined us here today, because I feel, honestly, I feel privileged to share ideas with Roger, of course. Hopefully that goes without saying. But also everyone who joins us, every time we get a unique mix of people and several ideas flowing through. And it's, don't want to get too kind of romantic about it, but it's a really cool thing that happens with these live streams. I think Corey's comment might actually, do you want to give us a bit of an elevator pitch for Sunday?
I would, yes. The direct answer to that question, Corey, is no. Actually, this is supposed to be a debate, and I don't think we're arguing about anything. So there's that. But we will be talking about this issue in great length on Sunday, because our guest panelist is Carol J. Adams. And she's here to talk about her updated pornography of meat. And then we're also going to talk about some wider issues within the movement, probably talk about sexual politics as well. But I'm sure ecofeminism is gonna come up there. I mean, obviously, Carol's got her own position about the idea of rights, you know, male mind and all that. And that's probably going to raise its head, I would think, on Sunday. So Sunday, that is 5 p.m. British and Irish time for anybody from elsewhere, as it were, other areas of the spinning globe that we sat on.
It is spinning these days, isn't it?
Yeah. I think slowing down, I don't know.
Well, yeah, I guess you could look at it either way. So also, Jonah's just commenting on the nature of mutualistic and symbiotic relationships between humans and other animals. And so-called working animals and developing, you know, in more maybe more Eastern cultures and stuff. I think. Yeah, do you want to say anything around that? I always leave the easy ones to you, so I'll let you have this one.
Well, even the idea of symbiotic relationship creates the issue of consent. You know, who's consenting to that?
Right.
So so that will be a problem. And of course, you do get. I mean, even I noticed that the vegan strategist has changed his position of late, saying that we can have this symbiotic kind of relationship where we provide shelter and they provide eggs, or they provide milk and this kind of stuff. And this is coming from a vegan. A vegan. I'm doing rabbit ears. Yeah. And
what do you have against rabbits?
Yes. Well, nothing. I like their ears.
Leave their ears alone. My mom's just pointing out another time zone change here. But I think what you just pointed out flows nicely into Nikki's comment that, even if, horses are treated well, they're, oftentimes free living, taken out. And even if they're not, bred for that existence, this goes back to the so-called horse riding discussion we were having earlier. So I think we try to kind of fit it into human parameter A.
Some people would argue that the other way around, wouldn't they? They would say that a free living horse will almost guarantee to live less long than a captured horse, wouldn't they?
Well, and I think it'd be quite speciesist for us to say what horses who are out in nature, what they would prefer. I think it's difficult to know. Maybe it's down to the individual, but I think that's the interesting thing about animal rights philosophy. I think it oftentimes has more questions than answers, but the question's worth asking.
Well, in terms of free living horses, it would be hard to think in terms of, even from the horse's perspective, that there'd be anything better than running with your herd in a wide open kind of expanse of North America. That you can't really, it's like it's like kind of you see free living birds all flying together, in the V formations, of their changing, they're cooperating, all that. But it's hard to imagine that there's anything that captivity can improve on that.
It's kind of a human-centric lens, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like there's an interest in kind of filming some of your street conversations. So I appreciate we're all kind of, well, at least you and I are on lockdown at the moment. So that's probably a future discussion. But I think it'd be interesting to film some of your chats and see what happens. I think that'd be a useful tool for people.
Yeah, if you look at there's very little clips on it, but Jennifer Faust filmed a couple of clips when we were doing the VIP thing, but it's a bit more chaotic than the kind of Ed and Joey type things, whereas that's kind of set up as a one-to-one, whereas it's almost like an all-comers type thing and everything. It's really interesting. In one of them, I slipped up and I started using specialist language because they were talking about, I think they were talking about seals, and they kept using the word it, and I just fell into it. So it goes to show.
So you started to refer to other animals as it.
I did, yeah. I think I did it once, and I was thinking, whoa, where did that come from? And of course, the other person used, like a language thing,
Well, and I think that goes to show it's progress, not perfection. I mean, how long have you been thinking about these things? I think we all make, maybe errors. It's a matter of learning from those and moving forward.
All morning I've been thinking about
it. Put a seal on it. Well, I think with that, do please join us on Sunday. This has been a really great chat. I think we went a bit longer than planned, but it's been very fruitful. Join us and guest panelist Carol Adams, author of the Sexual Politics of Meat, on Sunday 5 p.m. UK time. And with that, thank you, everyone. Any closing remarks? This is your last chance.
Well, I just want to say something about Rama's latest point, which is about other animals. Yeah, the idea of
hang on, let me go get a cup of coffee.
In your own domestication. I think what I would say there is that David Nibert's book on domesecration is interesting there, in the sense of looking at. But I do know there is that kind of theory that maybe injured puppies, sort out the comfort of a campfire and this kind of stuff. So there is that theory about in terms of its validity and reliability, I'm not sure, but I know that's there. So.
Well, I was just thinking as a bit of a primer for Sunday, should we play that primer clip that we have planned as part of the outro now? You game for that? You know what I mean? That
No,
there's a
don't-
1 minute.
I'm completely
That's what makes these debates fun. We don't even know what each other means.
the head's gone.
There's that 1 minute clip that we had prepared for Sunday, but we might as well play it now too, just in case people are curious what they're going to get in store for that discussion.
And have you've got it, have you? Because I haven't.
I've got it.
Oh, you've got it. Yeah. Well, do it. Do it. And you don't
He's got it.
Look at that. We're going to disappear in something after all. Just get on with it, mate. What's the matter with you?
See everyone on Sunday. Bye.
Eating animals acts as mirror and representation of patriarchal values. Meat eating is the reinscription of male power at every meal. The patriarchal gaze sees not the fragmented flesh